curious how people survived the Great Depression on just pennies. When life handed them stale bread and questionable ingredients, they didn't just survive. They turned the impossible into, let's just say, food that required some determination to finish. Rustic vegetable soup was the ultimate clean-out-the-fridge meal. It was simple and delicious, and as an added bonus, you didn't need a plan. Grab whatever vegetables you had lying around, carrots, potatoes, celery, basically anything that hasn't gone to mush. One of the great things about this soup is that it is no fuss from beginning to end. Our ancestors from the Great Depression era weren't aiming for fancy restaurant vibes, but rather just some homey, wholesome-feeling goodness. You didn't really have a specific recipe, but more of a suggestion on how the preparation went. You could add beans, pasta, or that half-used zucchini you've been side-eyeing in the pantry. The base was solid broth, maybe a couple of herbs and some salt. Even if you weren't the most talented chef, this wasn't a problem. All you needed to do to make this lunch was to chop up some veggies, toss them in a pot, and let them simmer. Voila! All of a sudden, you've made a meal that could feed a family for days. Your kitchen will smell like you've been working on that lunch for hours, but instead, it was the stove that has been doing all the heavy lifting. Rustic vegetable soup was cheap, healthy, and a great way to use up all odds and ends before they got bad. So next time your veggie drawer is looking tragic, remember, rustic vegetable soup is here to save your grocery budget. Fried corn fritters were a Depression-era favorite because they made something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and very versatile, so in times when money was tight, corn fritters were everyone's go-to. All you needed was a little cornmeal, flour, water, or milk, and an egg if you could afford one. Mix it all up, fry it in some oil, and lunch is served. These fritters were the perfect way to turn pastry staples into something delicious. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with flavor. And because cornmeal was so affordable, you could whip up a batch without thinking about how much money it cost. You could even throw in whatever you had in the house to stretch it even more and add nutritional value. Any leftover veggies or cheese added more flavor to the meal, making it even more comforting. Corn fritters were the kind of meal that made you feel resourceful and proved that even in hard times, you could take a handful of basic ingredients and make them into something delicious. Depression-era mac and cheese was a budget-friendly comfort food that made you feel like you were living large on a dime. While today's mac and cheese might be full of fancy and expensive cheeses, back in the day, it was all about making the most out of basic ingredients. A boxed pasta, some milk, and only if you were lucky, some cheese. But you better pull that smile off your face. It wasn't the gooey, cheesy kind that we know of today. It was more of a humble, lightly cheesy dish that could fill you up, don't get me wrong. The trick was stretching those precious bits of cheese as far as humanly possible. People would thin it out with milk or even water. And if money was really, really tight, they would use flour to make a roux, a mixture of flour and fat that was used to thicken sauces. It definitely wasn't gourmet, but it was cheap, and the most important of all, it was food. Even with such limited sources, this dish managed to be a crowd pleaser, especially with kids, who were just excited to be eating pasta. Depression-era mac and cheese was a smart way to turn a few simple ingredients into a meal that seemed indulgent, even if it was light years away from today's extravaganza. But you have to admit, sometimes you don't want that fully spiced-up mac and cheese. Sometimes you crave a simple canned version that won't make you regret eating it later. And that's exactly what Depression-era mac and cheese achieved. Tomato soup with rice was a Depression-era lunch that combined simplicity with a great deal of comfort. You didn't need much in order to make it. Just a can of tomatoes, or even water and tomato paste, a handful of rice, and any seasoning you like. This was the perfect meal for a cold, rainy day when you needed something warm and filling that could stretch your ingredients and make them last a week. Rice was the main deal here. It could bulk up the soup, turning a thin tomato broth into a hearty meal. With rice, you can always assume that a little goes a long way, and it turned what could have been a sad bowl of red water into a meal that actually felt like food. Plus, rice was very cheap, so adding that to your meals meant you made sure that a small pot of soup could feed the whole family. And while it wasn't really gourmet, you could get your creative freak on and make it special. A few tricks included adding a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity and a pinch of garlic powder to make it zesty. Tomato soup with rice was the kind of meal that will get you through hard times, without making you feel like you were missing out on some great delicacy. It was simple, satisfying, and budget-friendly. Savory bread pudding with leftover veggies was the ultimate Depression-era hack for turning scraps into a hearty meal. Got stale bread? Perfect. Leftover veggies that are past their prime? Even better. This dish was all about not wasting a thing. People couldn't afford to throw food away during the Great Depression, but instead, they got creative. And this meal was one of those everything but the kitchen sink meals that you might have heard your grandma or great-grandma talking about. To make it, you had to tear up the stale bread, mix it with eggs and milk and whatever leftover vegetables you had lying around. It could be basically anything. Carrots, peas, whatever didn't make the cut for last night's dinner. Season it with salt and pepper and maybe some herb seasoning and bake until it is golden and crispy on top, but soft and warm inside. The best part about savory bread pudding was that it made something delicious out of things you would usually throw away. And the Great Depression didn't look kindly upon those who didn't know how to save up. Stale bread was transformed from slices into a cozy meal that tasted like it took more effort than it actually did. This dish proved that even in hard times, you could make a meal out of practically nothing. Spaghetti with garlic and olive oil was a Depression-era meal that proved you could make something delicious from only 3 ingredients: spaghetti, garlic, and olive oil. You could whip up a dish that felt fancy without emptying your wallet. This was the kind of meal that made you look like you knew what you were doing in the kitchen, even when you were just throwing stuff together. Boil the spaghetti, then toss it in a pan with sizzling garlic and olive oil, and in a matter of seconds, your home smelled like an Italian restaurant. Sure, you didn't have any meat or sauce, but who needs them when you have garlic to do all the heavy lifting? Olive oil gave the pasta a nice, silky coat, while the garlic brought the savory punch that made you forget how simple the dish actually was. If you had the means, you would sprinkle some Parmesan or red pepper flakes on top, but even without these extras, the pasta hit the spot. This dish was a Depression-era go-to because it was cheap, easy, and quick to make. And sometimes, less is more. Deviled eggs with pickles were a treat that turned humble ingredients into something delicious back in the day. Eggs were a cheap, reliable protein source, and if you had a jar of pickles, you were already halfway to creating something fancy, by 1930s standards anyway. Making deviled eggs is nothing revolutionary. Just hard-boil them, scoop out the yolk, and mix with a little mayo, mustard, and the thing that ties it all together: pickles. The pickles added a crunch that took the eggs from plain food to a party snack. However, the only party trick was surviving yet another day on a shoestring budget. People loved deviled eggs because they felt like a special treat, even when times were tough. The pickles added that little something extra, like a surprise flavor bomb in the middle of your egg. Plus, it was a great way to stretch a meal. Eggs were filling and they were perfect for families who had to make do with limited supplies. Whether served at lunch or as a snack, deviled eggs with pickles were a fun, zesty way to make an ordinary ingredient feel a little more special. Carrot and potato hash was a Depression-era staple that made the most out of 2 cheap and hearty veggies. Potatoes were filling while carrots added just enough sweetness to keep things interesting. This meal was perfect for stretching a limited budget because both ingredients were as cheap as they come, lasted forever, and could be found in almost every kitchen. The preparation was simple. Chop up the vegetables, toss them in a hot pan, and fry until golden and crispy. It was simple, but the combination of soft potatoes and slightly caramelized carrots created a comforting, flavorful dish. If you had an onion lying around, it could join the party, adding even more depth to this humble hash. The beauty of carrot and potato hash is in its versatility. You could eat it on its own or throw an egg on top for some protein. Either way, it was filling, warm, and super satisfying. Everything you needed to keep going during tough times. It wasn't the most exciting dish, but it got the job done. And isn't that what really counts? Onion and potato frittata was an everyday favorite because they turned simple ingredients into a meal that felt special. Potatoes were cheap and filling, and onions added the extra flavor. The beauty of frittata was in its simplicity. You'd slice up some potatoes and onions, fry them until golden, and then pour beaten eggs over the top. Cook it until the eggs are set, and just like that, you had a hearty, savory dish that worked for any meal. It was one of those dishes that could stretch to feed a crowd. Plus, if you had a little cheese lying around, you were going to become a favorite lunch host. It was an easy way to make a meal feel complete without having to use any expensive ingredients. This frittata was super versatile as well. You could throw in whatever veggies or leftovers you had on hand. Whether eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, onion and potato frittata was a reliable go-to that made the most out of limited supplies and left you feeling full and satisfied. It proved that a little creativity could vastly change the food game in the house. Moving on to something sweet for a second, rice pudding with raisins. It was a Depression-era answer to a comforting dessert made from almost nothing. Leftover rice, milk or water, some sugar, and a handful of raisins were all it took to make your kids happy with a sweet treat. The magic happened when the rice simmered down into a creamy, pudding-like consistency, turning something so plain into a dessert that felt a little indulgent. Raisins were the main show here. They added the perfect amount of taste and texture, making it taste fancy rather than ordinary. Just the thought of raisins makes me want to retch. I truly admire the strength our ancestors had when they were able to eat food like this. Don't get me wrong, I love rice pudding, but raisins? No way, not a chance. The best part about rice pudding is how flexible the recipe could be. If you were like me and didn't like raisins, you could just sprinkle some cinnamon on top, or maybe even a splash of vanilla if you were feeling fancy. For families looking to make a warm, sweet, and filling dessert, rice pudding with raisins was the perfect way to go. It satisfied almost every sweet tooth without costing much, making it a household favorite. Plus, it was really simple to make, so even the kids could help and stir the pot. Some of those kids are now our grandparents teaching us those same recipes. How beautiful is that? While we're on the topic of sweets, let's talk about baked apples with cinnamon. They were the ultimate Depression-era dessert which could turn just a few apples into something that felt warm and comforting. Apples were relatively inexpensive and easy to come by, and baking them with a sprinkle of cinnamon transformed them into a dessert that made everyone feel like they were indulging. Making baked apples was as simple as coring the apples, placing them in a dish, and stuffing the centers with a mix of cinnamon, sugar, and maybe a little butter if you had some. And into the oven they'd go. In a matter of minutes, your house smelled like a bakery from dreams. The apples would soften. Their natural sweetness was enhanced by the cinnamon, and the result was a dish that felt way more luxurious than it actually was. This was a dessert that required very few ingredients, but the payoff was huge. It was warm and delicious, and made you feel like you were eating something truly special, even in the middle of hard times. Whether served on their own or with a bit of cream if you had it, baked apples with cinnamon were a simple pleasure that lifted spirits without draining the pantry. Fried rice with vegetables was the ultimate Depression-era hack for making leftovers exciting again. Day-old rice was the perfect base because it was cheap, filling, and easy to stretch. And just like with rice pudding with raisins, rice came to steal the show. You'd take whatever vegetables were on hand, carrots, peas, onions, or anything nearing its expiration date, toss them in a hot pan with a bit of oil, and fry it all together until golden and fragrant. Nothing, and I mean nothing, goes to waste. This dish was about making the most of what you had. It didn't matter if the veggies were a little past their prime because once they hit the pan, they were given a new life. A little soy sauce or garlic added a ton of flavor, and if you were lucky enough to have an egg, you could crack one in for extra protein. The fried rice was a genius way to turn scraps into something satisfying. It was fast, flavorful, and filling, everything you needed in a meal when times were tough. Plus, it was incredibly versatile. You could throw in any leftover meat or keep it vegetarian, and it would still be a hearty dish that stretched the food budget. The savory grilled cheese sandwich was the Depression-era comfort food that made even the simplest meal feel indulgent and like you were having a feast. With just bread and cheese, you could create a warm, melty sandwich that instantly lifted your spirits and comforted you during the hard times. The bread was cheap, and cheese was a luxury, but a little bit went a long way when you fried it up between two slices of bread. The secret to a perfect grilled cheese was in the toasting. You'd butter the bread or use whatever fat you had. Lard worked too, and fry it in a hot pan until golden brown and crispy. The cheese would melt inside, creating a gooey center that made this sandwich popular to this day, even though the ingredients were simple. If you were lucky, you could add extras like tomatoes or onions, but even on its own, a grilled cheese sandwich was a crowd pleaser. This meal was quick, easy, and, most importantly, cheap. It was perfect for lunch or dinner, and you didn't need much to make it satisfying. In tough times, a grilled cheese sandwich was a little slice of comfort, proving that even the most basic ingredients could come together to create something delicious. Simple egg drop soup was a staple because it took next to nothing to make, but still felt like a real meal. What you needed was some broth, homemade or from whatever scraps you could find, and a few eggs. You'd bring a broth to a simmer, whisk the eggs in a bowl, and slowly and carefully drizzle them in a hot liquid while stirring. The eggs would instantly cook, turning into soft, silky ribbons that made the soup what it is to this day. If you've got leftover veggies, be prepared to make this soup, and if you've got meat, even better. You've just made yourself a delicacy. Egg drop soup was a meal that stretched what little you had left while still managing to be comforting and filling. Even if you were running low on ingredients, egg drop soup made you feel like you were eating something homemade and special, instead of scraps you could barely gather. It could warm you up, fill you up, and the best thing of all, it took you, maybe and only maybe, about 5 minutes to make. My personal favorite from this list, mashed potato patties. They were a genius way to use up leftover potatoes while creating a tasty treat. Potatoes going to waste during the Great Depression? Now that's just vile. It was like the 8 deadly sins. If you had leftover mashed potatoes, you'd mix them with a little flour, maybe an egg if you had one, and season them up with salt and pepper. Form them into patties, fry them up in a pan until they are crispy, and suddenly those leftovers were a star of the meal. Their crispy outside and soft inside made them everyone's favorite, even though they were made from the simplest ingredients. You could eat them on their own if you had some gravy or maybe even some vegetables. Now that's a whole meal if you ask me. Mashed potato patties were a hit because they were so easy to make and could feed the whole family with minimal effort. Who doesn't like fried potatoes? I know a person that doesn't. My mother. Nothing fried will ever step foot in her kitchen. So there weren't any potato patties for us. Actually, that's not true. They were just oven-baked. I guess they weren't so bad. I am just bitter that they weren't fired. Fried potato patties were crunchy, satisfying, and a great way to give new life to everyone's favorite pantry staple, potatoes. Homemade vegetable pancakes were a Depression-era favorite for stretching limited ingredients. The beauty of pancakes in general is that you could throw in anything you had lying around, from vegetables and fruits to nuts and chocolate. But for veggie pancakes, people usually turned to carrots, potatoes, onion, and zucchinis. They were a great way to get something warm and filling on the table without needing a lot of ingredients. They were easy to make, cheap, and full of flavor thanks to the caramelized veggies. They could be served for breakfast, lunch, or dinner since they were so versatile. Plus, they were a sneaky way to get kids to eat their vegetables. Anything in pancake form will be eaten in a matter of seconds. These homemade vegetable pancakes were a resourceful way to show just how creative people could get in hard times. And on the upside, they were fun to make and even more fun to eat. Let's take a moment and admire the moms of the last century. They were creative, never failing in trying to make their kids healthy and happy. Always on the go, always trying to make the best possible meals for entire families. These homemade vegetable pancakes are the perfect example of that. I mean, just thinking about putting veggies in pancakes makes me want to barf. But hey, when all you had in your pantry were veggies, you had to make some use of them. Sweet potato bisque was a Depression-era dish that made something rich, special, and comforting out of the simplest ingredients. Sweet potatoes were cheap, filling, and packed with nutrients, making them a staple. To make this bisque, you'd boil the sweet potatoes, mash them up, and blend them with water or milk to create a smooth, creamy soup. Add a bit of salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle of cinnamon, and you had yourself a bowl of warmth and comfort. What made sweet potato bisque so great was how satisfying it was for so little cost. The natural sweetness of the potatoes gave it a rich flavor without the need for expensive ingredients, and its creamy texture made it feel indulgent. Whether eaten on its own or with a slice of bread, this bisque was the perfect way to fill up during tough times. It was a simple, hearty dish that provided warmth, nutrition, and comfort. It is popular to this day and considered somewhat of a luxury. It is widely used in high-end restaurants, whether it is served as a side dish or as a full-course meal. And by that I mean, it is served on those big plates with just a sprinkle of food in the middle, which costs more than my shoes. But never mind that, it was and is, to this day, a fall staple. Fried green tomatoes. No, I am not talking about the 1991 movie by the same name. They were a Depression-era favorite that took something as simple as unripe tomatoes and transformed them into a crispy, delicious dish. Tomatoes that weren't ripe yet were a common sight, and instead of letting them go to waste, people fried them up. For the preparation, you had to slice the tomatoes, coat them in cornmeal or flour, and fry until golden brown and crispy. They were a perfect combination of tangy and crunchy. The slight bitterness of the green tomatoes was balanced with the crunchy cornmeal, which made them surprisingly addicting. Again, they were a good way to get your kids to eat some veggies and fuel their bodies with healthy nutrients. As an added bonus, they were extremely cheap to make, using the ingredients everybody had on hand. Fried green tomatoes were a great way to add variety to meals during the Depression. I think this dish takes the cake as the most unbelievable, because it's one thing to eat and use up old veggies that are near their expiration date. But to eat unripe fruits and vegetables, that's a whole other story. But this meal should serve as an example of how far people would go to survive in the hard times. Baked potato bar was the Great Depression gem that turned a humble spud into a customizable feast. As we've learned so far, potatoes were one of the cheapest groceries back in the day, so they were widely available. This made them the perfect base for a meal. You'd bake a bunch of potatoes until they were soft and fluffy, then set up a bar of sorts with whatever toppings you could scrape together. Butter, leftover veggies, a sprinkle of cheese, or even some canned beans all work to turn that plain potato into something exciting. This do-it-yourself approach lets everyone in the family get creative with their toppings, making mealtime fun, even with limited options. The best part is that potatoes play as a blank canvas in this recipe. You could add whatever you thought fit the best. So even if you ate them every day, you wouldn't get tired of them and they'd still be interesting. A baked potato bar was the ultimate budget-friendly meal that let you feel like you were in control of the lunch. Well, as much as you could be during the Great Depression. Cabbage and potato stew was a Depression-era lifesaver that filled you up without emptying your wallet. Cabbage was very cheap, and potatoes added the starchy heartiness that needed to make this stew a stick-to-your-ribs kind of meal. You'd chop up the cabbage and potatoes, toss them into a big pot with some water or broth, and let it all simmer until soft and flavorful. If you had a carrot or onion lying around, throw that in too, it wouldn't hurt. This stew surely wasn't the most glamorous meal of all, but it got the job done. Were you fed after it? Yes. So it did what it needed to do. It could feed the whole family while costing almost next to nothing. The best part, you might wonder? That big batch you made yesterday is even better tasting today. In tough times, cabbage and potato stew was the definition of comfort food. It wasn't fancy, but it was nourishing, satisfying, and made the most out of simple ingredients. Plus, cabbage could stretch for days, so this meal often became a household staple when the budget was tight. Chickpea salad was the Depression-era version of a light, protein-packed lunch that didn't break the bank. Chickpeas were cheap and easy to store, and when mixed with a few pantry staples, they became the star of a surprisingly tasty salad. All you needed were some canned or cooked chickpeas, a bit of oil, vinegar, and whatever veggies or herbs you had on hand. If you had onions, celery, or even a tomato, chop them up and toss them in. This meal felt refreshing, yet filling. The chickpeas provided protein and fiber, while the vinegar and oil dressing brought everything together with a bit of zest. Chickpea salad could be served as a side dish, or just slap it between some bread and call it a sandwich. It was perfect for when you needed a quick, no-cooking meal. It was budget-friendly and packed with nutrients. It's no surprise that people still enjoy chickpeas to this day and make an effort to incorporate them to their daily nutrition. It was and still is one of those dishes that made you feel like you were eating healthy, even though your pantry was running low on options. Minestrone soup was the ultimate Depression-era kitchen sink meal. Got some leftover veggies, a can of beans, and a bit of pasta? Throw it all in a pot and call it minestrone. This soup was a go-to for families looking to stretch their ingredients as far as they could. Carrots, celery, potatoes, or whatever you had on hand, everything went into the pot with some broth or water and simmered until the flavors melded together. To this day, minestrone soup is one of my favorites, and for good reasons. It sparks up a nostalgic feeling in my bones and brings up old memories. Each fall and winter in our house, it was known that for the next few months we will be eating only cold weather food, which meant minestrone soup, cabbage, stuffed bell peppers or zucchini, pumpkin-tasting anything. You get the gist. So every year, as the leaves start changing colors, I know it's time to get the warm clothes out and prepare our bellies for 6-ish months of warm, comforting foods. It's not said in vain that it is the most beautiful time of the year. Let me get back to the soup. It was a hearty, filling soup full of nutrients, and on top of that, super adaptable. The beauty of minestrone was that no two batches were ever quite the same, but they were always delicious. This soup was great for feeding a large number of hungry mouths on a budget, and it only got better as it sat in the fridge. Moving away from my favorite soup of all and onto something a little less. I don't want to sound mean, so I am not going to say anything at all. But it's enough to say that I am not a fan of this next one. Vegetable stir-fry with rice. It was a favorite back in the day for its low price and because it was a great way to use up any leftovers. The concept was simple. Grab a few vegetables, carrots, cabbage, onions, or whatever you had, chop them up and toss them in a hot pan with some oil. Stir-fry until everything was crispy and cooked through and serve it over rice for a filling meal. Rice was the perfect base for any meal because it was inexpensive and went a long way. The vegetables added color, texture, and nutritional value, making it seem like it was a specialty of some sort, without too much cost or effort. If you were lucky enough to have some soy sauce or spices, you could add even more flavor, but even with just salt and pepper, this stir-fry got the job done. It was also one of those dishes that felt a little fancy because it came together so fast and tasted great, even when the pantry was looking sparse. Like I mentioned before, cabbage was one of those winter dishes that just added something comforting to the table. So we mustn't forget cabbage rolls. Cabbage leaves acted as a wrapper for a mixture of rice and onions, and sometimes ground meat, though during the Depression, the filling was often just rice and whatever vegetables were available. Once rolled up, the cabbage bundles were simmered in a basic tomato sauce, which made them tender and flavorful. They were a great way to stretch a small amount of food to feed a family. The cabbage was cheap and plentiful, and the rice was filling, so even if you didn't have much to put inside, the meal still felt hearty. The tomato sauce added a bit of extra flavor so the dish didn't feel dry. This dish is still widely popular in the East, only it's called something a bit different: sarma. Sarma is a traditional dish in some Eastern countries like Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and others. And it's definitely not considered cheap there. It is a true delicacy of those parts, and people proudly make it for big and important holidays. It is interesting how some dishes can be considered both a delicacy and a budget-friendly alternative in hard times. To finish off with a warm hug, let's talk about potato leek soup. This soup turned humble ingredients into a creamy, comforting dish. Leeks added an oniony taste to the dish, which nicely complemented the mild taste of potatoes. You'd sauté the leeks, add chopped potatoes, and simmer them in water or broth until soft. Then, mash or blend the mixture for a creamy, rich soup without the need for cream. It was perfect for cold days when you just scream for something to warm you up. It was also a great way to use up any leeks or potatoes you had on hand, and like most Depression-era recipes, it was adaptable. You don't have leeks? Use onions. No broth for the soup? You do have water, right? There wasn't a single excuse you could have for not making this delicious meal. Potato leek soup was a comforting dish that made you feel like you were indulging, even if the ingredients were modest. Did you find any familiar meals from your childhood on this list? If you did, comment it down below, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.